All right, so we are going to pick up our next unit, which is the biology of the mind, which is, we're going to be talking about the pieces and parts of the brain, starting with the neurons and working our way up. Now, sometimes people, why do we not talk about biology? This isn't biology, this is psychology. Well, the reason for that is because more and more, like I've alluded to and kind of mentioned before, more and more our psychology is based in the brain more than we've ever thought. So it's really important for us to understand how that works. So, kind of surveying the chapter and overview, we're going to start today with the building blocks of the mind, neurons, how they communicate, what neurotransmitters are, what they're used for, what it means if we have too much, what if it means if we have too little. Then next time we're going to talk about the nervous system, the functions and parts of the nervous system, and what effects those have on our behavior. Then we're going to talk about the endocrine system, which is the slower communicating part of our biology. It's the hormones, all of the hormones, but nonetheless equally important. And then we're going to talk about the brain and its structures and functions. So going way back to the beginning, in the early 1800s, a guy named Franz Gall started doing this thing called phrenology. And basically what phrenology is, it's the study of the bumps on the skull and their relationships to the mental abilities and characters. So he made charts kind of like this one over here that, they would touch your head and they would say, oh, look, this part of your brain, if you have a bump here or indent here, it must mean that you do this and this and that. And while we realize that the bumps and indents don't actually have anything to do with our behavior, he was right in the sense that we do have dedicated parts of our brain that are related to the different behaviors and things that that our body does. So, if we look here on the bottom, for instance, we know that we have the sensory motor strip and the sensory strip and the motor strip on the top of our head. We know that our frontal lobe is heavily involved in thinking and planning and judging. We know that the vision is in the back of our brain. We know that that hearing is in the temporal lobes on the side of our brain. So he was on to something, just at the time he had no way of really kind of confirming his thoughts. But phrenology is an important a term that you should be familiar with. It's kind of the original mapping of the brain per se. I get ahead of myself. So in today's search for the biology of the self, we have this field called biological psychology. This involves neuroscience, it involves behavior genetics, it involves neuropsychology, and it involves evolutionary psychology. So any time that we're looking at biology and applying it to psychology, and there's lots of different subtypes of that. All of these specialties explore different aspects of the same question: how the nature of the mind and behavior is rooted in our biological heritage. What's passed down? What roles does genes play? Are there specialized functions and structures in our brain? What happens if they're right? What happens if they're wrong? What happens if something, interacts differently, or why does it interact differently in some and not others? So that's kind of the question that they're all asked. And then the study of the biology of the mind begins with the atoms of the mind, or the neurons. And this is what we're really going to take a look at today. So the neuron, what is the neuron? Okay, the neuron is basically this cool little guy like this. Okay, and it has kind of a structure that you need to know. The first things first, cell body. Hopefully, remember this from biology over the years. It's the life support center, and then off of the cell body, there's all these little dendrites. Okay, and dendrites are like the fingers. They stretch out to the other neuron and they grab and they receive the messages. Okay, and then we have the axon, which is kind of this sausage-looking structure, and this is what the axon does is it takes the message through the cell body. The dendrites grab it from the cell body through the axon, okay, and it carries it away from the cell body to the other neurons. Okay, now the axon is encased in something called the myelin sheath. Now, the myelin sheath, it covers the axon of some neurons, and it helps speed up neural impulses. Okay, so it's kind of like, one of the things I say is like the axon is the sausage and the myelin sheath is the casing, and it holds everything in tight and makes sure that the message could get to where it needs to go. And then on the opposite end of the neuron, we have the terminal branches of the axon. So here at the little end, you can see these things. This is where the message passes through here, okay, and then the neurotransmitters spit out the end here, and this is what forms the junctions with the dendrites of the other cell. Okay, so there are billions and billions and billions of different types of neurons, okay, and there's three major types of neurons that you need to know, okay? There's sensory neurons, there's motor neurons, and then there's inner neurons. Sensory neurons carry sensory information. Motor neurons carry motor information, and inner neurons connect the two because sensory and motor neurons can't communicate. Their dendrites and terminal branches don't fit together. So we have the inner neurons, which kind of help them to communicate. And we have billions and billions. Our body is just made up of all of these intricate webs of neurons. And then the neural impulse, which is sometimes referred to as the action potential, okay, is the electrical signal that moves down the axon. So what is the action potential? What does it do? Well, it's the impulse that travels down the axon like a wave, okay? Just as a wave can flow to the right in a stadium, even though the people only move up and down, the wave moves down an axon, although it's only made up of ion exchanges moving in and out. What does that mean? Well, if we kind of take a close-up of one of our little sausages, so as the message is occurring here, okay, we have these series of positive and negative charges. We call this depolarization. Okay, so when the message comes in, okay, the neuron starts to depolarize, and it goes in and out, and it travels in and out on something called sodium-potassium pumps. Okay, the axon is lined with all these little sodium-potassium pumps, and the electrical charge causes this thing called depolarization, which then uses that positive-negative repulsion attraction, and it kind of moves it along our axon into our terminal branches. So when does the cell send the action potential? Well, we're back to this word called a threshold, when it reaches a threshold. So the neuron receives a signal from other neurons. Some are telling it to fire and some are telling it not to fire, right? Because they're webs, they're all connected. The threshold is reached when the excitatory signal fire signals outweigh the inhibitory don't fire signals, okay, by a certain amount. So there has to be more that say fire, fire, fire than ones that say don't in order for us to reach this threshold. So when the threshold is reached, the action potential starts moving. Like a gun, it either fires or it doesn't fire, okay? So neurons don't kind of fire, they don't halfway fire, okay? They either do or don't, okay? And we call this the all or none response, okay? So the neurons either all the way fire or they none fire. Totally not proper English. So then how the neurons communicate with each other? Well, again, the action potential travels down the axon from the cell body to the terminal branches. The signal is transmitted to another cell. However, the message must first find a way to cross the gap between the two cells. So remember, we have the terminal branches here that are spitting out the signal, and then we have the dendrites that are grabbing. Well, they have to get close enough here so that the neurotransmitter, the message, can go across, okay? So they kind of come together like this, and the little junctions in between are what we call the synapse, or the synaptic gap. Okay, so what does this look like close up? Okay, the synapse is the junction again between the axon tip or the axon terminal, okay, of the sending neuron and the dendrite or cell body of the receiving neuron. Okay, so we have our little close-up here. Okay, sometimes this is referred to as the synaptic junction or the synaptic gap. So it reaches the action potential, reaches the end. There's a bunch of little vesicles containing different neurotransmitters depending on the message that's being sent. Different neurotransmitters will travel down here, okay, hit the end, and then kind of burst and explode into the synaptic gap and then fill into the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. Now, what are neurotransmitters? Well, neurotransmitters are chemicals used to send across the synaptic gap. So we have lots of different neurotransmitters in our body, and every neurotransmitter has a specific receptor site on the dendrites. Now, what happens to all the extras? Okay, so after the neurotransmitters, go across the gap and they fill up, and there's all the receptor sites are full. Well, what happens to them? Well, something called reuptake happens, which is basically the recycling of the neurotransmitters. Okay, so after all the receptor sites down here are full, okay, the rest of those neurotransmitters get sucked back up into the sending neuron, waiting for the next message to be sent for them to fire. Now, how does this neural communication, like all the steps together? Again, we have the electrical impulse, the action potential, travels down the neuron's axon until it reaches the tiny junction called the synapse. Okay, when the action potential reaches the axon terminal, it stimulates the release of neurotransmitter molecules. Okay, and these molecules cross the synaptic gap to bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. Okay, this allows electrically charged atoms to enter the receiving neuron and to excite or inhibit the new action potential. Okay, and then after the sending neuron then normally reabsorbs the excess neurotransmitters in a process called reuptake. Okay, so this is kind of in a nutshell. Action potential, firing of the neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap, connecting with the receiving neuron. Everything else gets sucked back up in reuptake. Now, what are some of the different neurotransmitters? We have lots of them. This is just kind of a drop in the bucket, but these are some of the big ones that we're going to keep coming back to when we talk about different things in psychology. So serotonin. Okay, serotonin is linked to depression. Okay, it affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. Not enough serotonin is linked to depression. So when you take antidepressants, the goal of some of them, certain ones, is to raise the serotonin levels, to increase the serotonin neurotransmitters that your body has. We have dopamine, which has to do with movement, learning, attention, and emotion. So too much dopamine is actually one of the theories we have between schizophrenia and one of the causes of schizophrenia. Now, not enough dopamine is linked to tremors and decreased mobility in Parkinson's disease and also in ADHD. Acetylcholine, or ACH, this enables muscle action, learning, and memory. So ACH producing neurons deteriorate as Alzheimer's disease progresses. So when you have when we start to see the degradation of the ACH neurons, that also is part of why we start to lose some of our memory and ability to learn and form new memories with Alzheimer's disease. Norepinephrine controls alertness and arousal, and an undersupply can depress your mood, and it can cause ADHD-like attention problems. GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and not enough GABA is linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. And then glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's involved in memory, and an oversupply can overstimulate the brain, causing migraines or seizures. And this is why some people are super sensitive to MSG, because MSG is kind of it mimics glutamate, and so it can trigger certain things in you. So if we kind of look at our brain, you can see that we have different pathways for different neurotransmitters. So you can see here we have our serotonin pathways, okay, and then here we can see we have our dopamine pathways. Okay, serotonin helps to regulate mood, and as we go in and talk about the brain, you're going to see that a lot of where this pathway is our limbic system, which regulates our emotions. Whereas with dopamine, you can see here in dopamine how the pathway kind of comes up to the front. Well, this is a lot of our auditory cortexes in here, as well as our frontal lobe, which has to do with decision-making, planning, and judgment. So how do neurotransmitters activate receptors? It's like a lock and a key. When the key fits, the site is opened. Okay, so neurotransmitter molecules, like we said, each have specialized receptor sites on the receiving cell. Okay, so and it precisely fits. So it knows exactly where to go. When the key, when it locks in, it unlocks it, and then the message is sent. But we also have things that are what we call agonists and antagonists, or keys that almost fit. Okay, so agonists and antagonists are things that are fake neurotransmitters, basically. So an agonist fills in the receptor site and activates it, acting like the neurotransmitter. So when you have an agonist in your system, okay, the body thinks it's receiving that neurotransmitter. Okay, an antagonist, okay, fills in, okay, but it's not enough to lock it, so it blocks it, okay, and so it cannot then, so then the neurotransmitter, or the, yeah, so that the neuron will not fire now because this agonist is blocking it, not allowing the message to be sent. Okay, so agonists mimic, antagonists block. Okay, so that's where we're going to wrap up today. So really important things that you need to make sure that you understand from this section is you need to understand how a neuron, the parts of the neuron, okay? You should be able to draw a neuron and or label the parts of a neuron if you are given the neuron. You need to make sure that you know that there are sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons, okay? And you also need to understand kind of how that action potential works, how it travels down, okay? Sodium, potassium pumps are on the axon, okay, which causes the depolarization, which kind of fuels it through. Okay, and then when it crosses, or the neurotransmitters come out of the terminal branches, okay, cross the synaptic gap, and then are received on the dendrites of the receiving neuron. Okay, so make sure that you're understanding all of that function. And next time we're going to pick up with the nervous system.